When you hear Minecraft, what's the first thing you think of? Maybe it's the nostalgic memories you made as a kid, or maybe it's nothing if you've never played. Regardless, your first thought probably isn't math. But if you look closely, math is everywhere. From architectural patterns to complex flying machines to even fully fledged redstone computers, the applications of math are endless. Today, I want to dive into the math of a classic Minecraft build, the Infinite Piston Extender. I hope you enjoy. In case you've never played Minecraft, here's what you need to know. Minecraft is a 3D sandbox game full of cube-like blocks. When in creative mode, you can place or break blocks anywhere you'd like, allowing you to build whatever you want. Most blocks are pretty simple, like stone, dirt, or wood, and they don't really do anything. But there's a category of blocks called redstone, which are a bit more complicated. Many of them mimic real-life circuitry, such as redstone dust, which acts like electrical wire. One of the most popular redstone blocks is called the piston. When a piston is activated, it extends, pushing any blocks that are in front of it. And when a piston is deactivated, it retracts. There's also a variant of the piston called the sticky piston, which is very similar. The difference is, on retraction, sticky pistons stick to the block directly attached to them and pull it back. Well, in most cases. As it turns out, if they receive a really short pulse, they drop their block. And while that might seem annoying, it actually makes sticky pistons really useful. Give them a short pulse and they'll push a block and leave it there. But give them a long pulse and they'll grab the block and take it back. This versatile nature is why sticky pistons are the star of this video. So what is a piston extender? A piston extender is the idea of using many sticky pistons to move a block further than just one piston could. For example, this is a 2-piston extender. We have 2 sticky pistons in a row, followed by a block, as well as some redstone circuitry. When I turn it on, it pushes the block as far as it can, utilizing both sticky pistons. And when I turn it off, it brings the block all the way back. And you can make a piston extender with any number of sticky pistons. No matter how many you have, there's always a way to push the block all the way out and bring it all the way back in. What I'm interested in is the specifics of how that's done. In this video, I want to answer these questions. What is the optimal sequence of sticky piston firings for the extension and retraction of a general N-length piston extender? And then for the Minecraft nerds, what is the best way to implement these sequences for real with a redstone circuit? Let's start by giving each sticky piston a unique number. This will allow us to describe sequences as just a list of numbers. I'll call the piston closest to the block piston number 1. Then the numbers will count up by 1 for every piston getting further away. And this scheme has the nice property that a piston's number is also the number of blocks in front of it. Now let's talk about extension. Remember, to fully extend a piston extender, we need to push the block as far as possible utilizing every piston we have. Now, during this process, we should probably only use short pulses, so that every piston we fire will drop its block. After all, pulling a block back is counterproductive to extension. Also, when we're completely finished extending, I'd prefer the pistons to look like this with a 1-block gap in between each one. This isn't necessary, but it'll make the retraction later on a little bit easier. With that out of the way, what is the optimal sequence of piston firings during extension? Starting off as simple as possible, consider a 2-piston extender. There are only 2 choices of pistons to extend first, either number 1 or number 2. Notice that number 2 is pushing 2 blocks, while number 1 is pushing 1 block. So I'm going to start with number 2 simply because it's doing more work. It feels more valuable. From there, all we have left to do is extend number 1, and we're done. The sequence 2-1 is a valid extension sequence for a 2-piston extender. But is it optimal? In other words, can we prove that this is the shortest sequence possible? Well, if we go any shorter, then the sequence would only be 1 long, and you can't extend 2 pistons using only 1 extension. To move the final block as far as possible, every piston should fire at least once. Mathematically, this means that for an N-piston extender, the extension sequence has to have at least length N. Therefore, 2-1 is indeed the optimal extension sequence. It has a length of 2, and we've shown that you cannot go any shorter. Next, consider a 3-piston extender. Once again, the piston that's pushing the most blocks is the piston in the back, number 3. So let's extend that one first. After doing that, what we have left is essentially another 2-piston extender, which we already know the optimal sequence for. It's 2-1. Adding that to 3 gives us a final extension sequence of 3-2-1. This is optimal because you cannot have less than 3 extensions for a 3-piston extender. Furthermore, it looks like we can just continue this pattern forever. The optimal extension sequence is just n to 1. So, unfortunately, there's a problem. While building this with redstone, I just remembered that pistons have a push limit. You see, to make pistons not completely overpowered, the Minecraft developers put a cap on how many blocks they can push at once. A piston can only push up to 12 blocks at a time, which is very problematic. For example, let's try to apply the n to 1 sequence we just derived to a 13-piston extender. We start with number 13, and we immediately have a problem. Number 13 can't extend, because it's trying to push 13 blocks, which is over the push limit of 12. So let's go back to the drawing board. Don't get me wrong here, the n to 1 sequence is still the best sequence for piston extenders of lengths 1 through 12. The problem starts at length 13, because that's the first time the push limit becomes an issue. But what if we just ignored this issue and kept going with the rest of the sequence anyways? Perhaps by doing so, it'll stir up other ideas. After all, 12 can still extend, and so can 11, 10, 9, all the way to 1. Amazingly, after executing the 12 to 1 portion, we got pretty close to what we want. The only problem is that 13 and 12 are still next to each other in the back. But we can just extend number 13 to kind of push the problem along, and then extend number 12, 11, 10, all the way to 1. And just like that, we've created an extension sequence for a 13-piston extender. The sequence goes from 12 to 1, and then 13 to 1. Let's keep going with this. Next, a 14-piston extender. Once again, I'll start the sequence with 12 to 1, and after that, we still have a clump in the back again. But we can push it all the way out by extending 14, 13, 12, all the way to 1. So it looks like the extension sequence for lengths greater than 12 is not too bad. We can just start off with 12 to 1, and then push out the remaining stuff with n to 1. Unfortunately though, this strategy is still not good enough. Because what if we have something huge, like a 30-piston extender? We can still start off with 12 to 1, there's no problem there. But then, if we try to extend number 30 to push the rest out, well, number 30 is still over the push limit. However, we can break off another 12-block chunk by doing 24 to 1. Then, we can do 30 to 1, and we're done. A sequence for a 30-piston extender is 12 to 1, 24 to 1, 30 to 1. This process of breaking off 12-block chunks is crucial because it can be repeated forever. Which means that we've successfully found a way to extend any length piston extender. More formally, we can create an extension sequence for any n by doing the following. When n is less than 13, simply do n to 1. Remember, that's when the push limit is not an issue. Otherwise, start with 12 to 1, continue doing the next multiple of 12 to 1 until you can't go any further, and finish it off with n to 1. In other words, break off the first chunk of 12, continue breaking off chunks of 12 until you can't anymore, and if you have a chunk left over, do that too. Great, now that we have a formula, let's do some examples. When n is 8, 8 is less than 13, so the extension sequence is simply 8 to 1. When n is 40, we start with 12 to 1, then 24 to 1, then 36 to 1, and finish it off with 40 to 1. And when n is 24, we do 12 to 1, then 24 to 1. That's all we need because it already ends with n to 1. Now, you might have noticed that I stopped talking about whether or not these sequences are optimal, and that's because I don't actually know. I mean, it feels like it, but admittedly, I haven't made a formal proof. I've started one, but I just can't seem to get it. So I'm gonna leave that to you all. Let me know in the comments if you think this formula always produces an optimal extension sequence. The sequences we've created so far only activate one piston at a time. But if our eventual goal is to make a redstone circuit for this, we should probably think about which pistons can fire in parallel. Let's go back for a second to the 13-piston extender. The sequence for this was 12 to 1 followed by 13 to 1. Let's call these two parts of the sequence subsequences. 12 to 1 is the first subsequence, and 13 to 1 is the second subsequence. As it turns out, the second subsequence doesn't have to wait for the first one to finish. Visually, this makes sense. Notice how during the first subsequence, the chunk in the back is just sitting there. To To represent this new parallelized sequence, let's put the second subsequence under the first one and treat each column as a unit of time. Now, what happens if we start both subsequences at the same time? Well, the first column says to extend both 12 and 13, which is unfortunately impossible. That would be like trying to extend both 2 and 1 in a 2-piston extender at the same time. Pistons just don't work like that. Okay, but what if we start the second subsequence just a little bit later? This time we start with 12, then we do 11 and 13 at the same time, then 10 and 12, 9 and 11, etc. Amazingly, this works. By using parallelization, we have drastically improved the speed. The original sequence was 25 long, but this new sequence is only 14 long. And with this new technique, we can speed up the examples from earlier too. When n is 8, well, actually there's nothing to improve there, we only have one subsequence. But when n equals 40, we can arrange the 4 subsequences like this, with each one starting one column after the previous. As you can see, this creates a massive speed up. And when n equals 24, we can do the same thing. Alright, I think it's time to build this with redstone. Well, that took a while, but I'm really happy with the result. When I press this button, it eventually fully extends. It's genuinely so fun to watch because you can literally see the chunks being broken off and moving towards the front. And it's so fast. I didn't expect that at all, but I am not complaining. The way the circuit works is really cool. I'm quite proud of it. Basically, we have one main line, which I like to think of as a flowing river, because no matter where you power it, the signal will travel down the line, as if it got thrown into a current. So, to create a subsequence going from some number down to 1, all you have to do is find that number and power the main line. For example, to extend a 24-piston extender, we can power the main line at the 12th piston, which generates 12 to 1, and then at the 24th piston, which generates 24 to 1. Then we just have a secondary line to automate that. When the button is pressed, the signal travels along the secondary line, powering the main line along the way, which creates all the subsequences. Very nice. Time for the other half, retraction. Remember that a piston extender is made up entirely of sticky pistons, which drop their block if they receive a short pulse and pull it back if they receive a long pulse. Extension used only short pulses, but retraction is going to use long pulses. Any piston we activate during the retraction sequence will grab the block in front of it and pull it back. Starting as simple as possible, consider a 2-piston extender. Retraction has the opposite goal of extension, so why not try the reverse of the extension sequence? Instead of 2, 1, let's try 1, 2. Okay, that didn't quite work. It looks like we need to add another 1 to the end of the sequence. But why didn't the reverse work? Isn't retraction just the inverse of extension? Well, not quite. An inverse operation should undo all the work of the normal operation. For example, multiplication is the inverse of division because if you multiply by x and then divide by x, you're back to where you started. However, extension moves all the blocks in front of it, whereas retraction only moves the first block. That's the key difference. So reversing sequences won't work, but at least we found a valid retraction sequence for a 2-piston extender. 1, 2, 1. Next, let's retract a 3-piston extender. We have 3 options to start the sequence, 1, 2, or 3. If we start with number 3, it creates a 2-block gap, which is a death sentence because pistons can't reach across a 2-block gap. And the same thing happens if we start with number 2. So we have to start with number 1. After that, 3 still makes a gap, and 1 doesn't really help, so we have to do number 2. Now we have a choice. We can either pick number 1 or 3. I can't tell which one is better, so I'll just choose number 1. Then it looks like number 3 is the only one that helps, and now number 2 is the only one that helps, and finally number 1, giving us a final retraction sequence of 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1. While this might seem like a randomish looking list of numbers, it actually makes perfect sense. The first half, 1, 2, 1, that's the retraction sequence for a 2-piston extender. And the second half, 3, 2, 1, well, that shifts the gap all the way out and finishes the retraction. In fact, anytime you have a piston extender with just the backmost piston left, you can retract n to 1 to shift the gap out and finish it. Using this observation, we can create a very nice recursive formula. The retraction sequence of an n-length piston extender is just the sequence of an n-1 length piston extender followed by n to 1. The base case is when n equals 1, in which case the sequence is just 1. Now, if you haven't seen recursive formulas before, that's okay. Let's walk through how it works. When n equals 1, the sequence is just 1. That's pretty straightforward because it's given to us for free by the base case. When n equals 2, according to the formula, the sequence is the previous sequence followed by n to 1. When n equals 3, again, take the previous sequence and add n to 1. A recursive formula tells you how one answer relates to the previous one. And I want to reiterate why a recursive formula makes sense for a retraction sequence. In order to retract a 3-piston extender, you have to first retract a 2-piston extender. And for that, you have to first retract a 1-piston extender. Solving one problem is just a cascade of solving smaller, related problems, which is perfect for recursion. But what about efficiency? Does this formula produce an optimal retraction sequence for any n? Well, spoiler, it does. And the proof for this is really cool. Notice that every time a piston is fired, it moves exactly one other block in the world by a distance of 1 block. This might seem obvious, but using this property, we can calculate the minimum number of retractions required. For example, let's say we're about to retract a 3-piston extender. After it's completed, the final block traveled a distance of 3 blocks, piston number 1 traveled 2 blocks, piston number 2 traveled 1 block, and piston number 3 did not move. This gives us a total distance of 6. Therefore, the minimum number of retractions is 6, because each retraction can only contribute 1 block to this total. And sure enough, the sequence we get from our formula is 6 long, so it must be optimal. Of course, this only proves it for n equals 3, but hopefully you can see why this would be true for all n. Additionally, we can use the parallelization technique from earlier to speed up retraction. For example, with a 4-piston extender, split the sequence into 4 subsequences like this, and start each one column after the previous one. Here's what a 10-piston retraction looks like after the speed up. As you can see, this is way faster. Okay, I think we're ready to make this for real. Alright, that actually wasn't too bad. Probably because I used the exact same strategy as extension. This right here is the main line, and behind it is the secondary line. When I press this button, we should get a full retraction. Oh my god, there's so many being fired at the same time. That's insane. And I love how you can see them building up in the back as they finish. That looks so cool. I am ridiculously proud of this circuit. It might not be the smallest one out there, but it's mine. And it works. What we have to see now is a full extension and then a full retraction, just to put everything together. And let's make this bigger, cause why not? It's infinitely expandable, that's kind of the whole point. Okay, it's ready to go. This lever should extend it and retract it just like a normal piston. Here we go. Thank you so much to Sloime for creating the Piston Animations. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe, and check out my Patreon page in the description. I also have a Discord server, so come join us if that sounds interesting. I hope you learned something, I hope you enjoyed. Peace out, guys.